of the 16th century as their empire spread eastwards across the Indian Ocean. Trade in the region was already well established and carried out by Africans, Indians, and Arabs. Attacks on the trading cities of the Swahili coast and the Kingdom of Mutapa by the Portuguese did not bring any tangible benefits as traders simply moved to the north. Consequently, the Europeans decided to concentrate on the area which became Portuguese East Africa, aka Portuguese Mozambique, further south. Mozambique was settled by Portuguese who integrated with local communities in the country's interior. Mozambique remained a Portuguese colony until independence was achieved in 1975. Swahili Coast. The Swahili Coast, located on the shores of East Africa, was a region where Africans, Arabs, and Muslim traders mixed to create a unique identity from the 8th century called Swahili culture. Swahili is the name of their language and means people of the coast. The coast prospered from the 12th to 15th century thanks to its profusion of small islands and natural harbors. 35 independent trading cities like Mombasa, Mogadishu, and Zanzibar established lucrative trade contacts with African tribes in the interior and states across the Indian Ocean such as Arabia, India, and even China. Gold, ivory, tortoise shells, animal hides, and slaves came from Africa's interior to be traded for Asian goods like silk, spices, incense, Ming porcelain, glassware, coral, and jewelry. Then, in the final years of the 15th century, the Portuguese arrived to upset this century-old balance of trade. The first momentous move in this game of empires came with the 1498 to 1499 voyage of Vasco da Gama, circa 1469 to 1524. The Portuguese explorer had audaciously sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and up the east coast of Africa before sailing east to India. He thus opened up a maritime route between Europe and India, but he had also noted the trade ships laden with valuables anchored in the African Swahili ports. From 1502, the Portuguese were intent on muscling in on the region's trade, and they set about sinking ships, destroying cities, and building forts to achieve that goal. The Portuguese had a secondary objective in their attacks in East Africa, and this was to damage the Islamic world in any way possible. The Swahili coast was very much a Muslim-dominated area of Africa. As noted by the historian P. Curtin, the Muslim religion ultimately became one of the central elements of Swahili identity. To be a Swahili, in later centuries, meant to be a Muslim. 125. Those who followed in Vasco da Gama's wake sought one thing: total control of the Indian Ocean trade network. The Portuguese had superior weapons, and they used them to cause havoc amongst the Swahili city-states whose rivalries, for example, between the sultans of Malindi and Mombasa, prevented them from forming a unified response to this new and deadly threat. Achieving dominance with relative ease in the region, Portuguese settlers and merchants would eventually establish themselves at various points along the Swahili coast such as Malindi, Mombasa, Pemba, Sofala, and Kilwa. Many non-Portuguese traders continued their commerce, too, as the Portuguese found they could not police the entire ocean, and cooperation proved more lucrative than confrontation. The Portuguese established colonies in India, notably at Portuguese Goa, 1510, which became the capital of the Estado de India, the Portuguese empire east of the Cape of Good Hope. The Portuguese fully intended to control both sides of the Indian Ocean. As more colonies were established in India, the Swahili coast was repeatedly attacked from these bases. Already in 1505, the city of Kilwa was blasted into ruins by Portuguese cannons, taken over, and refortified. Fortresses were built along the coast of East Africa, notably at Sofala in 1505, Mozambique Island in 1507, and Shama in 1526. In 1536, the port of Massowa in the Kingdom of Abyssinia, aka the Ethiopian Empire, was captured. The ruler of Abyssinia was not too upset at the loss as he acquired firearms from the Europeans, which proved useful in his own battles with rival forces in the region. The Portuguese were delighted to find Abyssinia a Christian kingdom and an ally against what seemed an Islamic-dominated East Africa. Things went well at first when, in 1543, The Portuguese helped the Ethiopians defeat the armies of Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, circa 1506 to 1543, leader of the Adil Sultanate in the north. Unfortunately, the Jesuit missionaries from Portugal and indigenous Coptic priests in Abyssinia became anything but allies, and a civil war brought about the expulsion of the Europeans. A much more serious flaw in Portugal's foreign policy in the region was the total lack of interest in establishing any mutually beneficial trade arrangements with the Swahili cities or interior African kingdoms. The ports the Portuguese held were essentially mere collecting points for commodities. Nor was any lasting form of administration established. The Portuguese merely wanted to extract everything and anything of value at as little cost as possible, preferably zero. As the Portuguese presence grew, so they were able to take an even more aggressive stance against rival traders. Ships were blown out of the water, and trade goods were confiscated. The result of this rapacious policy was that traders moved northwards, and the Swahili coast went into serious decline. Mutapa as traders drifted away, the Portuguese then went for the next best thing, which was to find the goods at the source. To this end, in 1530 they took a greater interest in the kingdom of Mutapa in the far south, modern northern Zimbabwe and southern Zambia. The Bantu-speaking Shona peoples of Mutapa, established circa 1450, had inherited the region's trade network from its predecessor Great Zimbabwe, circa 1100 to circa 1550. Goods from Mutapa, like gold and ivory, were traded with Sofala, an outpost controlled by the most southern Swahili city of Kilwa. From 1530, the Portuguese tried to establish trade markets, feiras, within Mutapa, but their interference in local affairs, particularly their attempts to spread Christianity, brought them into conflict with the Mutapa rulers. In a familiar tale of colonial interference, the kingdom descended into a period of civil wars. A small number of Portuguese landowners clung onto the garrisoned forts at Sena, Tete, and Zumbo in the Zambezi Valley. Further north, the Portuguese were still causing havoc along the Swahili coast, exploiting the rivalries between cities and capturing Mombasa in 1593. A huge fort, Fort Jesus, was then built at Mombasa, which acted as a regional headquarters for the Portuguese. In 1633, a new strategy was adopted in Mutapa and, with the help of Portuguese settlers who had married local women, the Portuguese took over the kingdom completely. Unfortunately, Mutapa was nowhere near as rich in gold as had been hoped for. This was no Inca or Aztec civilization that their great rival Spain was plundering in the Americas. The decline in East African trade, the disappointment in the non-existent riches of Mutapa, and the fatal problem of tropical diseases resulted in the Portuguese crown abandoning its ambitions on the Swahili coast, and instead, they focused on Mozambique Island located between the Swahili coast in the north and Mutapa in the south. Batua, another Shona kingdom, took over what was left of Mutapa in 1693. Portuguese Mozambique. The area of what is today Mozambique was first inhabited by Bantu-speaking people who had arrived in the area as part of the Bantu migration from the 1st to 4th century. The famed Chinese mariner